Hi, I'm Chris. This video is going to be a little different to the other Yu-Gi-Oh videos I've made because I have a lot to talk about. In my video on various card types, I alluded to other types of cards that I didn't explain in that video because they were significantly more complicated. Those two types of cards are Pendulum monsters and Link monsters. Understanding these cards requires a fair bit of explanation, so not only will this be a tutorial on how these cards work, but also a little history lesson, as well as my own personal thoughts on why these cards are so divisive and how we ended up where we are now. Pendulums are very contentious in Yu-Gi-Oh, both from an inside and outside perspective. They are the primary example people point to when they say Yu-Gi-Oh is too complicated, or that cards are too difficult to understand. Playing with or against them requires specific knowledge that only applies to Pendulums. There were several formats where Pendulum decks dominated the meta in an overwhelming capacity. They killed Yu-Gi-Oh, basically. But today, Pendulums are nowhere near as relevant as they once were, and they feel significantly weaker now than they ever have been in the past. So how did this happen? Let's go back about a decade in time. Back in December of 2013, Konami announced there would be a new Yu-Gi-Oh anime in various sources like Weekly Shonen Jump and V-Jump magazine, and alongside it would be a change to the game unlike anyone had seen before. Konami likes to do this with Yu-Gi-Oh a lot. Every time there's a new mechanic added to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, there's usually an accompanying anime that is meant to introduce players to the mechanic and ease them into playing the physical card game. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds introduced Synchro Monsters to the game, Zexal introduced XYZs, Arc V introduced Pendulums, and Vrains introduced Link monsters. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In February of 2014, Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V was finally revealed, as well as the Pendulum summoning mechanic, along with some major rules changes to clarify gameplay. Arc V was advertised as bringing duels to life, dueling not just as competition but as entertainment, and generally making as big a spectacle as possible out of games of Yu-Gi-Oh! So what do Pendulums actually do? Well, Pendulums are a very confused series of cards. They're like 3 different types of game mechanics all rolled into one type of card, so we'll have to go through this step by step. During this period in Yu-Gi-Oh, the field of play went from looking like this to looking like this. These are Pendulum zones, and they are integral to playing Pendulum cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Pendulum monsters are divided into 2 boxes. The bottom box is relevant when Pendulum monsters are on the field as monsters and apply in pretty much the same way as any other monster effect. The second box at the top is relevant for when these cards are placed in the Pendulum zones. Similar to activating a continuous spell, you can put a Pendulum monster from your hand in a Pendulum zone, and while it is in that zone, it is treated as a face-up spell card that stays in that zone until it's destroyed. You can then use the effects in that separate text box, and they are treated as if they were effects that came from a spell. To clarify, Pendulum monsters are treated as monsters in all zones of play until you activate them in a Pendulum zone as spell cards. In Magic terms, this is kind of like how Grist is a creature literally everywhere until he hits the board. Pendulum is just an entire card type of Grists. This is the easiest part of the Pendulum monster mechanic. If this is all there was to the Pendulum mechanic, this video would not exist. We're just getting started. If a Pendulum card on the field would be sent to the graveyard, whether it's a monster or a spell, it is instead placed into a separate pile that is then put face up on the top of your extra deck. Why does it work this way? The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is because it relates to a mechanic I'll talk about in just a moment. But why would you design cards this way? Because of this unique quirk of Pendulum monsters, they interact very strangely with a lot of cards. Because they can't go to the graveyard, they can't be sent from the field to the graveyard as a cost to activate cards or effects. They can still be targeted and affected by such cards, but in this way, Pendulums still go to the extra deck instead of the graveyard as a sort of replacement effect the cards inherently have. Speaking of replacement effects, Pendulums interact with those in a strange way as well. There are some cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That say that any card that gets sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Pop quiz, how do you think these two systems interact with each other? If you said Pendulums don't care and get sent to the extra deck, you'd be wrong. They get banished by effects like these. Pendulums inherently have a replacement effect on them that sends them to the extra deck if they would go to the graveyard. Therefore, any other replacement effect that overrides where cards would go when they are removed from the field also affects Pendulums. There's probably a million other interactions like this that I'm missing out on explaining, but the mechanic is so obtuse I don't really care. The third and final mechanic that Pendulums utilize involves the numbers on the side of the cards and is referred to as pendulum summoning. These numbers are referred to as scales. If you have cards in both of your pendulum zones, you can, once per turn, perform a unique action where you can special summon any number of monsters from your hand or your face-up extra deck pile to the field as long as the levels of those monsters are between the numbers listed on the cards in the pendulum zones. These could be any monsters you have in your hand, by the way, not just pendulum monsters. Notably, this cannot include monsters with the same level as the listed number, just those in between. For example, if you have a pendulum scale with a number 2 and another pendulum scale with a number 8, you can only summon monsters this way that are levels 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 from your hand or the pendulum pile. This is the strangest part of Pendulums, and also why they are so difficult as a gameplay mechanic. All of these effects result in Pendulum being a very frustrating deck to play against in its early stages. These cards have a lot of versatility and utility depending on where you play them. When they leave the field, they enter a zone that's inaccessible by the opponent and become a resource for future turns. Even if you were to destroy all the monsters that a Pendulum player controls, as long as they still have cards to put in their Pendulum zones, they can summon all those monsters back to the field. They can be used as material for other monsters, and you don't lose any resources in the process. You can effectively cheat out monsters that normally would be much harder to summon. Another frustrating thing is that today, Pendulums have permeated themselves throughout every other summoning type in the game, adding even more complexity to cards that were originally relatively easy to understand. I hope that I am properly conveying that Pendulums weren't just a complicated system that made Yu-Gi-Oh! Difficult to learn. It was also a frustrating mechanic that warped the game itself for the people that played it. People knew it was a broken mechanic, and many players hated the concept and existence of Pendulums day one. This complexity bled into the wider trading card game culture and became the only thing that Yu-Gi-Oh! Was known for. To go back to the timeline of events, the Japanese Pendulum starter deck released on March 21st, 2014 in Japan, and in early July for the rest of the world. However, most people don't think of this as Pendulum's inception. That's because the starter deck had 2 total cards in it that interfaced with the new mechanic. Pendulum Summon Now, the box says, but you really couldn't do that. The actual product that is attributed to introducing Pendulums to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the core booster set, Duelist Alliance. Duelist Alliance is widely considered to be one of the most impactful sets in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and it wasn't even really because of the Pendulum mechanic. Duelist Alliance came out on April 19th, 2014 in Japan, and August 15th at the latest for everyone else, and it drastically changed what Yu-Gi-Oh! Players believed could be printed on a card. I'm just gonna directly quote SEMO and MBT in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist Alliance is the set in Yu-Gi-Oh! More than any before or after, it changed our conceptions of how we metagame, how we deck build, and how we play Yu-Gi-Oh! It is at this period that Yu-Gi-Oh! Starts to resemble the game that we play today, instead of, to some degree, a hackneyed Magic the Gathering ripoff that frequently ends up being unbalanced. Something about this year, man. Konami smelled blood in the water. They came in, killed everything we thought Yu-Gi-Oh! Was, and replaced it with something entirely new. Pendulum was only a small part of that effort. In the West, November of 2014, the new Challenger set gave us Cliffforts, our first meta-relevant Pendulum deck. It went about as well as you'd expect. It was immediately competitive with the top decks of the pre-existing format and forced them into a rock, paper, scissors type of meta where some decks were good against others, but not the other deck that was good at that time. This was eventually power crept by Nekroz in February of 2015, a deck that just kinda aimed to lock you out of the game entirely. I'm going to go through some of the major highlights from when Pendulums were meta relevant, but I want to make it known Pendulums weren't always part of the meta. Ban lists, set releases, and power creep occasionally kept the deck at bay, but they didn't keep it down for long. In May of 2015, Cliffforts came back using new tools to summon a monster they centered their entire game plan around. Huge asshole that was unaffected by everything and nigh impossible to deal with. We still call invincible cards like this towers to this day. December of 2015 gave rise to Pepe, not the meme, but this deck, known as Performapal Pendulum, that resulted in just an abysmal one-deck format in early 2016. There was nothing else that was viable at that time. In 2016, at this point, Konami seemed to be taking action specifically to combat the rise of Pendulum and keep the game relatively balanced. An emergency ban list was released, which caused players to experiment with various new strategies, but Pendulum was always present throughout the year of 2016 in the background of the meta. If not in the same vein as Cliffforts or Pepe, it was there in various forms like Magispector and Metal Foes. By 2017, the metagame had shifted away from Pendulum to make room for other strategies, but the power creep involved in making these strategies worth playing meant that decks had evolved into massive combos that produced unprecedented amounts of card advantage and oppressive effects on your opponent. Pendulum posed a design challenge to Konami, as they were very difficult to balance the game around, and each new Pendulum got absorbed into a Pendulum Singularity deck that only added to this problem. They still wanted to make more Pendulum cards, but things like ban lists and power creep could only keep the strategy down for so long. What Konami needed was to go back to the drawing board and reformat the game in a way that curbed Pendulum's power, but still opened up their options to create new, interesting cards with unique effects. They needed Link monsters. It didn't work. In December of 2016, a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Series was announced in various magazines, similar to how Pendulums were introduced. Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains was revealed in February of 2017, and also introduced a new game mechanic and some drastic rules changes. Firstly, the Pendulum Zones were no longer their own specific zone of play. They merged with the far left and far right spell and trap zones. This didn't change any of the mechanics of how Pendulum cards worked, but it did mean players technically had less zones to work with when playing Pendulum cards. The other major change was the addition of the extra monster zones at the top of the field. The monster zones that previously existed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Were now classified as main monster zones, with them and the extra monster zones sort of serving as parallels to the main deck and extra deck. In a game of Yu-Gi-Oh, there are 2 extra monster zones located in the 2nd and 4th columns that are shared between you and your opponent. However, each player can only control 1 extra monster zone at a time. If one player has a monster occupying an extra monster zone, they cannot occupy the other, except in specific circumstances. This is important because the new rules made it so that the monsters summoned from the extra deck had to be summoned to an extra monster zone. This meant that players could only control 1 monster summoned from the extra deck at any given time. However, you could control more. The only way to summon additional extra deck monsters to your field was to summon them to a zone a link monster points to. Link monsters were the main focus of the new Yu-Gi-Oh rules that were implemented that year, along with a new creature type that was sort of emblematic of them at the time. They're a type of monster that can only be summoned from the extra deck, similar to Fusion's, Synchro, and Celes. To summon a Link monster, you send the required materials that are listed on the card to the grave, and you place it in one of the extra monster zones. Link monsters are characterized by 2 main quirks, though. The first is that Link monsters do not have a defense stat. They are always considered to be in attack position and cannot have their battle position changed by any means. The second quirk is, depending on the number of materials used for a Link monster, they have arrows pointing to various zones on the battlefield. If you want to summon a monster from the extra deck, it has to either be in the extra monster zone or a zone a Link monster points to, regardless of who controls it. Some Link monsters have effects depending on the monsters they point to, though, so be careful. Link monsters also have very unique interactions with other Link monsters that make the mechanics significantly more complicated, though. It can never be simple. Firstly, Link monsters don't have levels. They have Link ratings, depicted by this number in the corner and by the number of arrows they have. Link monsters can use these Link ratings to contribute to the summon of other Link monsters. Here's an example. A Link 3 monster requires 3 monsters worth of material to summon, but a Link 2 monster can count as 2 monsters worth of material to summon that Link 3 monster. In this way, a Link monster's Link rating effectively determines how much that creature is worth, and then you have to use first grade math. Scary. The other unique quirk is how Link monsters interacted with each other. When a Link monster's arrow points to another monster, the monsters are considered to be linked to each other. 2 Link monsters that point to each other are considered to be co-linked to each other. This distinction is relevant because some Link monsters might have effects that care about this, but more importantly, if you had the ability to make several Link monsters that point to each other, you could build a line of Link monsters that bridge all the way over to the 2nd extra monster zone and take it from your opponent, locking them out of the extra deck entirely. This was referred to as an extra link. This is a very involved process and rarely seen nowadays, but it is possible and it did happen. The issue with links were not as obvious as they were with pendulums. In comparison, links were a much simpler mechanic, but that turned out to be the core issue. Link monsters were too generic, not in the sense that they were boring, but that they were too easily applicable to all types of decks in the game. To be fair, they needed to be in order for certain decks to be able to play the game at all. However, Link monsters were so much easier to summon than any previous card type in the game. Synchros required you to do math, Xyz required you to use monsters of the same level. Fusion summoning was a whole involved process requiring multiple different cards. But Link monsters have almost no restrictions. If a Link monster says it requires 2 monsters to summon it, all you need to do is send those monsters to the grave and put the Link monster on the board. Any deck can do that. Any deck that could summon multiple monsters with ease could abuse the mechanic, and any card that could produce multiple tokens became an immediate threat to game balance. Additionally, the lock that they had on the extra deck necessitated their play. Some strategies didn't rely on the mechanic that much, but as decks became more complex, links became harder and harder to ignore. Meanwhile, we have Pendulums. Now, I don't have any definitive proof that link monsters were invented to curb Pendulum's ability to resummon their monsters over and over again, but it was a reasonable suspicion among the community. Did it work? Well...
Let's perform the ever-powerful Pendulum Summonerino. So unfortunately...
But Joseph, don't you need link arrows for this?
Well, no. You can get one out of your extra deck using the extra monster zone. And, you know, it turns out, actually, most of them just end up in your hand anyway.
It's so great. I'm glad that we solved the outstanding issue of Pendulums. That's fun.
Glad to hear it.
Pendulum decks adapted. They were either constructed in a way to sidestep the issue entirely, or took full advantage of the new mechanic better than any other deck could. Turns out, when you have one strategy that produces a bunch of resources, and another that funnels all those resources into value, they mix pretty well. The next 2 years of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Had the meta ping-ponging between these two game mechanics, with 2018 resulting in probably some of the worst Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats of the game's history, back to back to back. 2019 was okay though. Konami kind of cleaned things up by then, and many people regard it as a fan favorite format, but I think this is largely due to trauma, but I digress. In 2020, Konami seemed to have come to a realization about the state the game was in, and it was sort of difficult to quantify, to say the least. Some drastic things needed to be done for the game's health. So some new rules were announced, and on April 1st, no less. There was no big advertising fanfare around this one. There was no new card type or summon introduced. Just some changes to some certain game mechanics. The most notable being that fusions, synchros, and Xyz monsters no longer had to be summoned to the extra monster zone or to a zone a link monster points to in order to be put on the field. This opened up several options for past and future decks, and meant you were no longer forced to play link monsters in order to interface with the game, unless your card type was specifically Pendulum. Pendulums were just too strong to be untethered from links, and thus they became the only card type that was forced to use them to play the game they wanted. This is why I had to make this video talking about the two in depth. You won't be able to play with or against Pendulum cards without also knowing how links work, and you won't understand why links are the way they are until you learn the history of why they even exist in the first place, which is all Pendulum's fault. Additionally, over the years, the philosophy of card design in Yu-Gi-Oh! Changed as well. Link monsters are no longer as generic and over-centralizing as they once were. Nowadays, specific decks might have specific link monsters that enhance their game plan, but those monsters don't really have much application anywhere else, if at all. Yu-Gi-Oh's used to be a game about denying your opponent the ability to play the game, whether that be through ripping their entire hand from them, or just straight up killing them before they could take a game action. Now interaction requires a lot more decision making. Have there still been bad formats of Yu-Gi-Oh since 2020? Yes, but I feel a lot of those can be attributed to specific decks or specific cards that require bans, rather than a mechanic baked into the game itself. So I guess that leaves us with the question of the video. What actually killed the Pendulums? Pendulum summoning has been nowhere near as prevalent as it once was. It's easy to say that this is the fault of the new rules and the link monster mechanic. Pendulums are the only card type constrained by it in this way, which can make them feel less worth playing. But I think the real thing that killed Pendulums is the same thing that happens in all games. It was power creep. Pendulums radically changed the game when they were first introduced. In order to compete, other decks had to go wildly over the top in terms of card advantage and interaction in order to compete. As more cards were printed, stronger options were needed to break parity. Link Summoning was introduced, and they were some of the only cards capable of matching the output of Pendulums. Now, Pendulum's ability has been diminished, but a lot of the power creep stuck around. Pendulum is actually a very resource-demanding game mechanic by modern-day standards. Not only do you need 2 cards in your Pendulum Zone to make the mechanic worse, but you also need to build up your resources of monsters you want to summon. Meanwhile, most decks nowadays are able to perform their entire setup off of a 1-card combo. Pendulum cards are a very unique and complex mechanic that can't really be allowed to be good without a bunch of asterisks and qualifications on them. But I will always respect Pendulums for their impact on the game, however negative it has been. Yu-Gi-Oh's identity before Duelist Alliance was mostly as the MTG ripoff with a silly anime. Now Yu-Gi-Oh is known as the complex card game. This is the point at which Yu-Gi-Oh comes into its own identity and diverges from everything else, including the silly anime. It fulfills a niche that no other card game does. That complexity is what still draws me to the game to this day. This does come with its own downsides though. As I said earlier, Yu-Gi-Oh is now and forever seen as the most complicated card game. The resources that exist right now don't do a good enough service of teaching the game. While I don't think it's Konami's job to teach players the meta of their card game, as it's a continually shifting thing, I do think the reality of how prevalent combos are and how archetypes work and what hidden information and card advantage even is and the role it plays in understanding the game should be incorporated into the learning experience of the average player if they are expected to continue playing the game. These concepts are not just integral to Yu-Gi-Oh, but all card games. And that's why I've been making the videos I have been on this channel. If more people knew about these concepts that are baked into Yu-Gi-Oh's complexity, I believe it would benefit not just new players, but all players of every single card game that's out right now. In short, the game's good, guys, I swear. It just took 10 years. Hi, it's me again. This video took a lot of effort to make, so I would really appreciate liking and subscribing and sharing it around to people you think might be interested. That sort of stuff. Thanks for watching, and see ya.